Again, thanks everyone for joining. Just as a reminder, this is going to be recorded. And I will actually hand it over to my co-host Ags to get us started.
Great, thanks, Kate. So we're so excited to have you guys with us for the next hour and a half to talk about a really important topic, decolonization and global health. We'll be going through what does it mean, what work needs to be done, and try and finish the conversation with key take-home points and action points for how we engage in global health as individuals in a community moving forward. So I'll give my brief introduction. My name is Agatha Forgeba. I go by Ags. I'm a third-year emergency medicine resident at LA County, USC. I actually graduated from the Charles R. Drew UCLA Medical Education Program in 2019, and I was a part of the Global Health Pathway. I first started engaging in global health over 10 years ago as a Princeton Africa Fellow in Gaborone, Botswana. And Kate and Risa were my mentors during my global health pathway time. Again, I'm super excited to really delve into this topic because I know in my field in emergency medicine, it's a hot topic and something that we're all interested in delving into more. And then I'm going to give Kate an opportunity to introduce herself and then segue to the panelists.
Great. Thank you. My name is Kate Dovel. As many of you know, I'm an assistant professor here at UCLA in the Division of Infectious Disease, School of Medicine. I'm a social scientist by training and have lived and worked for about the last 9 years in Malawi, working on health disparities around HIV services and access to care. Decolonization, mainly shifting power dynamics and control of global health decision-making and research has been a passion of our group for a long time, and excited to bring the conversation and to be a part of the conversation here at UCLA. Before we get started, we want to acknowledge that as a land grant institution, the Global Health Program, as well as UCLA as a whole, recognizes that the Gabrielino and Gongva peoples are the traditional caretakers of the Tomvangar land here in the Los Angeles basin, which is where UCLA sits. And before we introduce our panelists, I want to take a moment to kind of frame this event. Why are we here? What are we doing? Really, what this event is intended to be is a starting point for a discussion around how medical students, how different trainees who are entering into global health should and can start approaching the issue of shifting power dynamics within global health. We will be approaching this event with 6 panelists. We'll have 4 panelists live. 1 live panelist will be joining us shortly, as well as 2 panelists that are pre-recorded and from Malawi and from Peru, who will be introducing further on in the event. We only have an hour and a half. It's not long. And so it will be a brief coverage of a lot of different topics from a lot of different perspectives. And we're lucky to have our panelists that have very different perspectives that they bring to us. But it means that it is just touching on overarching topics, and it's the beginning of an ongoing conversation. We as the Global Health Program and as UCLA, we're dedicated to continuing this conversation and continuing developing tangible tasks and outputs on how we move forward in the agenda to shift power dynamics within our work in global health and within the field more broadly. So with that, again, not a lot of time. We're going to jump right into our panelists and introduce you guys. I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves with about a 2-minute bio. As a reminder for everyone, you should also have their full bios in the invitation for this event, as well in the chat. I believe Vegeta is posting, so you can have their full bio there. And we'll start with the first on my screen. Laura, if you can introduce yourself.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Laura Kumba. I am a clinical research professional currently working in HIV and COVID-19 clinical trials. And I've been doing HIV-related research as well as stigma research for the past decade. I am interested in decolonizing global health, and I co-founded the Duke Decolonizing Global Health Working Group during my master's program at Duke University, as a way to create a space for students to have conversations with faculty and staff members and practitioners in global health about the colonial roots of global health. And I'm excited to be here this evening.
Great, thanks so much. We're excited to have you. Nicole, can you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name's Nicole Redvers. I'm a member of the Deni-Nukwaya First Nation, originally from Denide, which is unceded Treaty 8 territory in what is known as the Northwest Territories or subarctic Canada. However, I work on the unceded territory of Lakota, Nakota, Dakota peoples and the intersect of the Grand Forks River Basin. And right now I'm in the middle of travel, so I apologize for my grainy video. I'm coming to you from a parking lot. Very high tech here, but it's working. So happy to be here.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us and for making it work. And your video looks great. You're totally fine. Sandeep, can you introduce yourself?
Sure, Kate. Hey, good evening, everyone. It's great to be here this evening. I, about 31 years ago, was sitting in your chair interested in a global health career, and we didn't have these kinds of sessions then, so I'm really happy that you have this kind of conversations happening. I had just finished studying a political science degree. I went on, became a family doc, trained here where I am right now in Monterey County at the County Hospital at Natividad Medical Center. And then after a few years, I joined CDC and was the CDC country director in Uganda, Malawi, and Zambia, and worked for about 15 years overseas, and then joined UCLA and was fortunate to work with Risa and Ags and Kate in Malawi, mostly on HIV programs and other outbreak response, working with UCLA the last couple of years before moving back to California last year. So it's great to be here this evening.
Great. Thank you, Sandeep. And we also have Dr. Carlos Ferran, who will be joining us a little later. Dr. Ferran is an assistant professor in global health at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, and also the director for the Centro Interamericano para la Salud Global in Costa Rica, as well as several other positions at Harvard and a couple other institutions. So we'll be happy to have him join us here shortly. As you can all see, we have a very diverse group of panelists and excited to hear from all of your various perspectives. Okay. With that, I'll hand it over to Ags.
Okay, awesome. So as Kate said, we have such a great group of panelists with diverse professional and personal experiences. And so as we get ready to delve into this topic, I wanted to start with definitions. So I'll ask all of the panelists sort of two questions. The first, what does global health mean to you? Because I think that's an important place to start. And then in that context, what does decolonizing global health mean to you? And anyone can feel free to jump in and start.
I can go ahead and start. So global health means to me, it's, global health is both international, but also local, right? The health of anyone who is living on this globe. And it's about health justice and health equity and making sure that every living being, not just humans, but every living being has the right to health and wellness. And in terms of decolonizing global health, because colonialism is a violent practice of domination and subjugation of indigenous populations and the erasure of their populations and their knowledge and their culture and their language, to truly decolonize global health is to really uproot those violent systems that are currently underpin the field, and also that govern the global health agenda that lead to basically being the opposite of what global health is and actually leading to global health inequities and global health injustices.
I can jump in here as well. Thanks, Laura. That's a great introduction to it. And I speak from my own community and from my own experience. And one of the things I want to highlight in the context of the global health conversation, which is often divided into global North versus global South, is that there are a number of subjugated populations, including, as Laura noted, indigenous peoples within the global North, including in the circumpolar areas that often get neglected and missed within those conversations and the binaries that exist between North and South. So I just wanted wanted to make that note as well as part of that consideration. And for myself, for my Indigenous community, the process of decolonization is really based on a clear framework that centers and privileges Indigenous life, community, and our epistemology, or a way of knowing, our way of being, and is directly rooted within the land and the country in which we reside. And I note clearly that decolonization in many cases in our communities is the countering or the outright resistance of colonizing thoughts, actions, and governance. It's not only the pieces, it's within ourselves and how we think in the process. So decolonization is essentially a verb or a method back to our original selves, acknowledging, of course, the diversity of that term and how it gets applied is a very important point about it. There's not a uniform definition that can be applied anywhere or to any one people's.
Thanks, Laura, Nicole. Yeah, I often think of comparing this to like hypertension, which may have a similar experience or perspective across different populations, but when we hear the word global health, the emotions and what is thought of by different individuals around the globe when that term is heard is very different. And so it brings up the question, who really has the right to define it? And I think maybe I'll just leave that question there, because I think it's that's a key symptom of the challenge that we're talking about. But I think it's important to be really concrete if we want to be able to take action. And when we think about global health, if you follow the money or overseas development assistance in health is the development lingo, about 40% of that is US government funding. So the US government, at least on a numerical, maybe not a per capita basis, plays the dominant role in global health funding across countries. And if you look at the pie chart in the current fiscal year, about $11 billion of that, it's almost all vertical funding. That means disease-specific initiatives. So most of my career was spent, I was paid for it through HIV dollars. So it's a disease-specific initiative. It's been a very successful initiative. The way Congress appropriates funds is critical to understand through the foreign assistance or budget, the F budget, and it's almost all vertical initiatives. So that means you have different staff, different metrics, different NGOs, and there's pros and cons. Millions of lives have been saved through that, and it's been wonderful from that perspective. But it's also there's a lot of advantages. You can do a very intense initiative for a disease. It's very measurable, saving lives. You can market it, and that's, I think, a key part of global health. While it's a paradox, while there's been amazing successes, it's also a business. There's incredible lobbying that happens by the organizations that get the funding. Much of that funding stays in the US, and the commodity that's being sold is really those images of helping often poor brown or Black people. And as opposed to horizontal initiatives or working across systems and building health systems, which is really what WHO, the World Health Organization, has called for. Countries will often want, but don't have the power to make happen. So that business ends up being a kind of neo-colonization that's part of a broader global health architecture of financing that helps perpetuate dependence and not allow countries to advance. There was this aberrance for 5 years under PEPFAR. PEPFAR is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, the massive $6 billion a year program that funded me, if you're going to work in global health, it's very likely you'll be funded through an HIV or a vertical initiative. There was an aberrance in 2009 to 2014 where for 5 years there was a big push for funding health system strengthening horizontal initiatives. And it was very exciting. There's amazing initiatives, the Health Metrics Network, Global Health Workforce Alliance. I don't want to get into too many programs, but a lot of those just disappeared after 5 years. Healthcare worker programs that were very exciting. And I think it built a taste in many countries for what could happen if global health was done differently. So in the end, many countries just learned to play the game because the money is needed for saving lives, but they know very, very well and very clearly that this is not the right way and it's hurting their country. As to the question about decolonizing, I think it's a good term, but I think we haven't matured enough, maybe compared to the efforts in anti-racism, to really understand that structural part of which I just described that goes into to be able to use the word decolonize, we need to understand the structures around us to be able to know what that means. I think it's a good term, but I think we need to understand that and break it down. Maybe at this point, I just say that, one way to do it is at this global national level, which is really a long-term initiative. It probably won't change in the next year, the way Congress appropriates funds in this conversation at an institutional level like UCLA and at our personal level. So I think it is a good term, and we need to break that down further. We stop there for now.
Thanks so much, Sandeep. Laura, I kind of wanted to direct this next question to you along the lines of like language and this use of the term decolonization as someone that that started a movement and effort on your campus. Do you see any dangers in the use of this term decolonization becoming such a buzzword and being sort of thrown around across campuses and in the larger global health community? Is there a better way for us to describe this task that Kate mentioned of shifting power dynamics and avoiding what we've seen as like colonizing decolonization? Especially since you were sort of like one of the first movers in bringing this term in.
Yeah, so short answer is yes, absolutely. In terms of as the term and the movement gains popularity, there definitely is a danger of that, and it's honestly has already happened, of that term being co-opted and being very whitewashed. And what people often, and I can honestly say even I myself have been guilty of this, when people are proposing solutions for decolonizing, they're really just proposing solutions to make it more palatable, right? And so in the context of global health, we're proposing solutions or changes that make us move us to innocence, or move ourselves to innocence, to make us feel better about the fact that ultimately we are unfortunately working in a field that was founded on colonialism and white supremacy and racism. And so for me, in terms of language, and something that I have tried to be very clear on, is when I say decolonizing, I really do mean that dismantling. And some people find that really radical, because that could mean that in the context of global health and the way that we know it today, right, would cease to exist. And so that is very challenging for people to wrap their heads around, because they don't know what it's like to have this radical imagination and imagine a future of equity and justice. However, oftentimes when I'm reading about proposals of what people could do to decolonize, or how we can decolonize global health, I often think of those as more anti-colonial approaches versus really a true decolonizing, where we're moving against colonialism. We're trying to not perpetuate colonialist behaviors and colonialist ideologies, which is a part of decolonizing. But I ultimately do think at the end goal of decolonizing is that you're really going to dismantle that system will no longer exist. And so I think the issue with, as this movement gains popularity, is sometimes we reduce it to efforts like diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is a very important effort, but it doesn't just stop there, right? Decolonizing doesn't just stop there with, it's not enough to just have my face sitting in a room or in a table. For me, when I'm thinking of decolonizing, I'm saying I don't want the table. That table is going to be gone, that everyone has access, and you don't need to create a space for me, because ultimately we are already working under this system of that space is there for everyone, and you don't have to create a space for me or invite me to a table, because that table does not exist anymore. So I think there's definitely is a danger, and I do try to think of when I'm very specific and clear, even with myself, when someone asks me about what are the key steps we can take to decolonize, I always flip it and say, okay, here's some anti-colonial approaches, recognizing that when I say decolonize, I really do mean dismantle and destroy, and recognizing that if that makes us uncomfortable, then we're really not trying to decolonize, we're really just trying to move ourselves to innocence. And again, that's, as Sandeep mentioned, in some cases, it is a term that people have not really fully wrapped their heads around and their minds around, and really thinking of what it would truly mean to live in a decolonized world. But yeah, for me, in terms of starting with that language and that distinction, that's how I think of it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laura. And I think this is all really helpful as we start thinking through it. I have some follow-up questions based on this. But first, want to welcome Carlos to the call. Thank you for making it amidst unexpected travel and different pieces. Carlos, we did introduce you already, but if you want to give a brief 1-minute introduction, and then we'll give you a specific question.
Thanks, and I won't delay you anymore. I'm sorry for being late to the host, the panelists, and the attendees. I'm currently on a crazy travel schedule. A meeting kind of ran late, as you can see from my blurred background. You can see my bed from my hotel right there. I'm in Lansing, Michigan, currently in a conference. So thank you again for the invitation. I won't introduce myself. I think I just don't want to push things back again.
Okay. Carlos, what we had just asked the panelists, and if you can answer for us as well, is first question is just looking at what do you see as a definition of global health, and what is your vision for decolonization?
Great, that's a great question, and I appreciate it. I've thought out long hard about the definition of global health that I'd like to work on, and for me, it's kind of simplified into one aspect, which is global health is the understanding of the interaction of the global processes with local processes. And between the interaction between that local and global, that's where global health happens. So it doesn't determine where that global health is happening, because again, interaction between global and local can happen anywhere. And it can be a variety of subjects. So let's say a subject like migration. Of course, migration's patterns are influenced by an array of global phenomena: global policy, global economics, global environmental change, demographic, and other types of transitions. But they are nuanced by local contextual factors, such as, again, local factors like local migration policies, availability of resource locally, etc. So we have this variety of interaction between the global and the local that determines what global health is. So for me, that is the definition of global health: the interaction, the understanding of the interaction between the global and the local. And decolonization, for me, is all about understanding and dismantling power structures. So we have the matrix of powers that are informed by historical, race, gender, class, etc. When we understand that in a power matrix, decolonization takes into consideration that dismantling, the critique and dismantling and the reimagination of a new form of organization as a society. So for me, that's what a decolonization means, and you can apply it to many things: the field of education, the field of research, knowledge systems, political systems, economical systems, etc. So if we apply it to global health, it would be, how do we understand, again, this collaborations, these interactions between the global and the local, and how do we dismantle the power structures that are influencing currently those interactions or those processes.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. And I think you're seeing a lot of synergies between these different definitions and ideas that the panelists are having. One question wanted to come back to is, as each of you are talking, we're talking about what is basically what is the colonization of global health, and that covered that a lot of it comes from the funding structures and what's in place. It comes from what's inside and interpersonally within all of us. And we'll hear from some of our recorded panelists. It also comes within the research institutions and expectations for productivity. But one of the things that Ags talked about, and Laura as well, is this colonization of the decolonization movement, right? That we're sitting here in the US talking about this, talking about solutions. How do we help ensure that we don't just rebrand colonization by coming up with US or Western global North solutions for these problems that are being experienced in the global South or low and middle income countries, whatever phrase you want to use there. And I guess I'll open that up to if anyone has a strong feeling about this question.
I think the one thing that's important is it's not really we in this essence of who makes these changes. You know, I think ultimately the steps for that process comes from the individual communities, as Carlos was noting, and how that derives upwards is so fundamental. And I think a lot about this question because we face this issue in Indigenous communities with treaty relationships, but also in other global sectors as well, where, the question always is, how do we make change? And, can we indigenize sort of these systems? And it's not about indigenizing or decolonizing existing systems. And I think the way we even talk about this sort of tells the story of the issue in the first place. What we need to be having, at least from an Indigenous perspectives, is our own systems. And then we adapt Western systems to it, as opposed to the other way around. So if we're not actually trying to make space, uplift and allow those conversations to happen and resources to happen on local levels so that those communities can be telling us what needs to be done, then we're not really on a process of decolonization. And, we're really firm about that in communities because we have so many issues with funders coming down saying, what are your indicators? These are your measurements. These are the things that you need to be doing. And we turn, you need evidence-based programs and so on. And it's evidence for who? Whose evidence is this? Show me a program that's based on, a randomized control trial with Indigenous peoples as part of that participant base. We have no evidence-based programs. We have evidence-informed knowledge that's been there for thousands of years. And we need to open space to allow those voices to come so that we can now learn and we can be, answering to those systems in a way and finding out how we can adjust our systems to community systems. So, I'm really picky with students about language and how we say, who is the role? Because we sort of say we in a community, but is it really we? I think that's a good question to ask ourselves as we move forward.
Great. I think there's a question from the chat group. They asked to anyone on the panel, if you could start with a blank slate, what would your dream vision of the global health field look like?
I can answer that question, but I just spoke, so I'll let somebody else take it.
Oh, well, I'll maybe start pondering on that. That's an unexpected question. I didn't. It's hard to imagine systems from a get-go when the system itself is built on a hierarchical model, so to speak, right? So in order to reimagine, again, you would have to start with this blank slate. But I don't know if we're starting with a blank slate where nation states are more powerful than others, or is that not the starting point? Or are knowledge systems all equitably important and we get to have dialogue? Is everyone agreeing that everyone has something to say and everything that someone has to say is equally as important? So I'm struggling with the question because the assumptions on which we built this question are how back do we have to go to get to this blank slate that we're assuming? So I would think that a decolonized global health field would not even exist in this world, so to speak. And part of it is because we all live in countries that depending on economic systems that are in itself very much from colonial worldviews. We live in a world where gender relationships are very much based on colonial worldviews. Our race and ethnic relationships are all very much based on colonial worldview. So I have a hard time imagining what that looks like without actually dismantling the whole thing. So I just want to kind of maybe ask the other panelists if they could imagine that kind of blank slate, so to speak. I couldn't even imagine wearing my clothes as I'm wearing it right now, and being in the place where I am right now. So.
I could express a few thoughts. Probably won't answer the question either directly, but I think the question is great because it illustrates the problem. And part of it is, I think as Carlos was saying, it's hard to imagine something that doesn't exist. and it's part of a much bigger system, just in a few different levels. One is the whole global architecture of power. I mean, it's obviously a much bigger conversation. I mentioned earlier that I did a political science undergraduate, and it definitely did not make me an expert. It probably just gave me enough information to be a little bit dangerous, but over time, it gave me an interest to learn more and more. I'm still learning, but the symbiosis of governments in keeping power is a fascinating area of study. And I just encourage students to read whatever you can and listen to stories, because it's the global health is part of a global health architect, a broader global sort of political economic architecture. One thing I learned over the years was that health is the sort of a driving social sector. So we know that only about 20% of health outcomes are due to health interventions. And I would sometimes feel if I could give half of our funding that we had in the health field, which was much more than the other fields, to our agriculture, education colleagues, to financing and social cost transfers, we'd see much more sustainable health outcomes. So that's one whole component of, we're talking about global health, but much of what produces good outcomes is not actually health interventions. And then the other part, I'd go back to what Nicole was saying, that I think history teaches us that the only way that oppression is fought is successfully, one is by the actions of the oppressed, because they know their reality, they know how to fight it. And we can only be allies. I find it very interesting, the sort of expanding diaspora community. When I worked in India, I always had this sort of duality of being American and Indian, and what role will that play increasingly in blurring the lines between local and global? I think we'll have to see as time goes on. So I also just think about World Health Organization, that has a lot of challenges, but has never really been given the funding and stable opportunity to have a bigger role. But their whole philosophy, at least, despite all their challenges, is based on equity and one country, one vote. And I think it all goes back to that, is listening to voices being at the table with power and making decisions. But how to get there in our current broken global system is a challenge.
Thank you so much to our live panelists. I think we've started on some really important points in our discussion, but I want to give an opportunity for us to hear from our recorded panelists who were not able to join us live due to differences in time zone. So I'm going to go ahead and briefly introduce them. So first, we're going to hear from Dr. Willie Lozano from Lima, Peru. Dr. Lozano has a PhD in global epidemiology and disease control from Johns Hopkins, and is an associate professor at Cayetano University in Peru, as well as a professor at multiple universities throughout the US. He is the lead for CLIMA, the Latin American Center for Excellence for Climate Change and Health and Emerging Infections, and as well as the lead for the master's program in epidemiology research at Cayetano University. And then our second recorded panelist that we interviewed is Professor Sam Peary from Malawi. He is the director of programs at Partners on Hope in Malawi, Malawi. Professor Peary is a clinician, a clinical epidemiologist, and has over 20 years of experience in strategic HIV program design and implementation. He has faculty titles in the Department of Medicine at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine at Chapel Hill, and the Department of Global Health at the University of Washington in Seattle. He is also a senior lecturer in the College of Medicine at the University of Malawi. So just for some context, the videos will be about 10 minutes, and we'll hear both of them speak about their experiences with power imbalances in global health, followed by their thoughts on what change needs to happen. There were issues with internet connectivity in the recorded videos. So there are some lags. It is likely not your internet. It was likely from the video. And then we also included some captions to help in the places where we could. Captions are not perfect, but they're a guide for all of you. So Vijeta, can you roll the clip for us?
The first part is how global health is defined and when it starts, because it's not defined in low and middle income countries. It's a construct that is created in high income countries. And when it's created and the movement is created, you don't have a lot of programs growing in low and middle income countries and centers and masters and other developments. It all starts in the north, and that this balance is created at the beginning. And the disbalance comes from a very natural reason, that it comes from the resources, because the resources for implementing global health come from the north as well. So naturally, there is going to be a disbalance. The question is, what can we do to adjust it? What is the colonialism part in there? And those are questions that students should ask themselves and should ask their faculty and try to address. And what do we want to achieve? Are we going to ever change the funding stream? Probably not. And we have to recognize the complexity of those funding stream issues. For example, decades ago, funding that came to low and middle income countries had label that need to be spent, at least in part, in some U.S. spending, U.S. products. That has changed. It's no longer there, but it's still the most important centers in global health funding, like the Fogarty International Center. They need to get their budget approved in Congress. They need to convince congressmen from very different constituencies that they need to invest funding away from the United States. And it's a very challenging situation. And the same thing with deans and the directors of Centers for Global Health. When they receive funding for global health, they receive it with the obligation to support their students and their faculty in the university. The target of those funds is not necessarily LMICs. And I think that needs to progressively change over time, but it's not going to change dramatically from one day to the other. And I say it with, complete recognition of the challenge and the limitations of the goal, but we still need to attempt to decolonize it by being realistic about what we're going to achieve. And I think it starts with understanding the basis and the complexity. I think we need a better definition of global health that is more inclusive, that it comes more from the South, and then define what is going to be a more even funding situation as well, given that is one of the central issues. But there are others, there are many others, and I hope that this conversation helps us to get through them. I think there are very focal examples that you can give, but you feel it in everyday situations. But some very specific situations are when students and faculty who are trying to generate global health partnerships come with very specific goals and targets in terms of productivity. And that's kind of tricky because those goals don't always come with resources that support them. So sometimes faculty or students come saying, I need to have a first authorship for my student. That's what faculty say, that's required from the program. It's required when we fund the ticket or when we find the stipends of the students. And it's very hard. It's very hard to guarantee that because there are no resources in many cases for what the student's going to be done here. They just hand us a really bright, motivated, well-qualified student for a very short period of time without a lot of resources in many cases. And then there are expectations and there are pressures. It's not that faculty are mean or they don't understand the context. It's reality. It's what they expected from them. So, and then, students have their own pressures. They want to, go to medical school. They want to get in the best residency programs they can. And they're very focused on performance, but they miss that they don't come to a low and middle income country to do global health for performance. They come to try to contribute to addressing imbalances in global health, to reversing, centuries of inequalities. They don't come here to check boxes and make points and get more lines in their bio sketches or their personal statements. That's not the goal. If they're coming for those reasons, they should rethink why they are in this field. But, that's what the system now in some high-income countries drives them to. So that needs to be part of also what students and faculty need to think about. And the other part of that is that we may be scientists trained in high-income countries, but living in now they were citizens of low and middle-income countries, live in a place like Peru or Brazil or some other place. But we're not just like a U.S. faculty. We have a double burden. We need to do the science, but we also have many other pressures, like every single little fire that happens in our research operation or institutional environment, we have to deal with it personally, usually, in most cases. Every case of COVID in your research team, every family, tragedy, every pressure, every single case of depression, your students, you tend to be very close to those front lines, and you need to address it personally in an environment of very limited resources and infrastructure. So we are not as productive, and we have a lot of pressure to be also as productive. So if we're talking about the pressures on US faculty or European faculty, the pressures on us are different and bigger. So we have to also be very careful that the playing field is not level at all. And these relationships, these partnerships need to be addressed in a very different way. And it's changed a lot, but it needs to continue changing. And this comes from the students. I trust that the next generation of students are going to make a big difference in this field.
Let's start with the beginning phase two. What are we talking about? The decolonization itself. That's what he's talking about over there. But we're talking about the independence, isn't it? So we're talking about independence, and when we talk about independence, we're looking at, in this case, I look at it as intellectual component and also the financial. So these are the key drivers of when you talk about independence. And if you want to talk about equity, you need to understand where the idea is coming from, what is the content of that, what is the direction, and also where is the funding. So these actually have an influence on what is going to come out. If I could say, is that there's a capacity built within the local organizations, rather than to say they don't have a capacity, so we should manage from here. But to say they don't have a capacity, we'll build that capacity. And then see who are the people that we can work on. And then in that case, we've seen a similar growth. Currently, now nearly completely Malawians, but before, most of them were expatriates. And this is a situation where most departments were led by expatriates. But now, which is 20 years down the line, most of the heads of department are the ones who are cut. So which means they are able to say, this is how we're gonna run this. What we require is a financial base in order to do this component. So when we are talking about the discussion on decolonizing global health, funding from both north to south will remain a necessity. I wanted to actually highlight that. It will still remain a necessity, and this can cause an automatic dependence. However, so in this case, donors will always have conditions as they will have to justify expenditures to their own source of funding, which is understood because we have to tick the boxes over there. But my expectation is that as we are working with those teams, they should see what is on the ground. And then there should be a time whereby to say, yes, these are the mandatory languages for this. In addition to these, what are the customized languages that you think you should be included in order for it to make a lot of sense, to contextualize the local capacity and the local component within that. So that's one of the things which I was thinking about that component. But we'll stop there for a moment.
Wonderful, thanks. So I think with the videos, we heard two then different perspectives, some on the experiences of colonized, unequal global health on the ground, and then also some on what do we do about it, what needs to shift. And I think interestingly, our two pre-recorded panelists talked a lot about some very tangible short-term moves that we can make toward what Laura talked about as anti-colonial, not really decolonization, right? I wonder from our live panelists, we can hear from you in terms of what we talked a little bit about what should this actually look like, and it's hard to think about what a completely decolonized, recreated system looks like. When we think about the next decade, what are some tangible things we would like to see move in global health in the next decade, so we can get closer to decolonization or anti-colonization, and how do we measure that? That's a very big, loaded question. Feel free to take pieces of that. I don't know, Sandeep, if you want to start us off.
Sure. Thanks, Kate, for the good question. Yeah, so, okay, I'm gonna, I think, stay with this global, institutional, and personal levels, because you can think of many levels, but I think it's useful. And I think we do need to decolonize and keep an anger about it and keep action about it and try to find any avenue. It is hard for me to separate that from, like I mentioned earlier, the global sort of power structure and countries deciding how they spend their funds with certain conditions attached and without listening first to host countries and other countries' priorities, and including them as true partners. But I wanted to switch a little bit to the I really love this approach with the anti-colonialism sort of initiatives versus the broader decolonizing. And I want to switch to the personal level a little bit, because I think here, just to make it practical, there's a couple of key principles I think are important for all of us engaged in this. One is that, we of course grow up with a certain lens from our experiences, and that lens, when we go overseas or engage globally, we are part of that power structure. We have privilege. And that lens of seeing the world is different than the lens of others. So that lens becomes a weapon, and invariably it risks and often creates harm despite good intentions. And the approach to trying to avoid that becoming a weapon is trying to, it's difficult, it takes a lot of work to try to understand another lived experience, which can only really be done through time and lots of listening. And I think all this happens until sort of it hurts. When you get triggered or something that doesn't make sense to you, that's when we all start to see another reality, because it doesn't make sense to us. And that's when also we start to have no choice but to really become an ally in supporting the priorities of individuals we're working with in other countries. So that's where I see at an individual level, is thinking through that way. It's not engaging in my mind, but it's questioning, constantly questioning and listening and trying to understand another lens. At an institutional level, I hope that there is a growth industry that's led by oppressed countries, but it comes to agreement on what are anti-colonial metrics that institutions can be applied. Most institutions, UCLA, others, accept global health funding, which is coming from a neo-colonizing approach to global health. And where can we push that as institutions with power? If all the academic institutions in the US that accept global health funding agree that they wouldn't accept certain conditions, there are other organizations like Doctors Without Borders, Partners in Health, that try to avoid US government funding for this exact reason. So I hope to see a growth industry in very specific metrics and sort of a benchmarked approach to making progress.
Great, thank you, Sandeep. Other thoughts?
I think one of the key pieces that was hit earlier, I think, with Sandeep mentioned that, this is the type of conversation that didn't happen even 5 years ago, in some cases, 10 years ago. We have a new generation of students and young people, hopefully with new perspectives coming, engaging with these conversations earlier on. And there's power in that youth voice and up and coming people within these spaces. And we see this in the climate movements. We see this in a lot of other social movements where young people are garnering large voices within institutional structures of change. And, it can be very overwhelming to think these large systems. And I always bring it down to the community level because I find that that's most relatable to people. And, what does that look like? And one of the things that often happens, of course, is that there's almost a level of mistrust that the communities can't take care of themselves. The communities don't know how to do this. They don't have the capacity. They don't have the resources to be able to do it. And I heard this my whole life, growing up in a small little, indigenous community in the subarctic, couple hundred people. We can't do that. And one of the things that we had realized after a while is that, we weren't going to have allies in that process in that time, many, many years ago, that we needed to create something on our own to be able to showcase the work and the capacity that we did have. And in that case, it worked. It was the first time after putting, blood, sweat, and tears from the community level in, starting to get eyebrows raised at governmental levels and foundations to say, well, wait a sec, this is actually making a difference. What are you guys doing? And then the questions start to switch around at that point. So, I think we can't forget the power of small projects in small places that end up being case studies or highlighted of things that this can work. It can work at a community level if it's done in the right way, and if the community is able to mobilize and have access to resources. I'm thinking of a colleague, Myrna Cunningham Kane, who's based in Nicaragua, who's created an entire indigenous funding organization. They refused at a certain point to accept any funding dollars. They specific to projects, they wanted it to come to them. They created a whole board, and now they distribute all of the global health funds that come through them. They are the decision makers of what happens with that fund, the evaluation metrics. So there's key examples of these groups that are doing this now. And then lastly, I want to mention, I'm a guest on the land that I operate and work. I'm originally from Canada. I'm in the United States. So I have to be an ally for the communities here. I'm not Lakota. I'm not Dakota. I'm not Nakota. I'm not Ojibwe. I'm not Anishinaabe. I'm not any of these places. I am a guest on the land, and I have to see myself as that. So I've worked incredibly hard to build relationships within the area, provide access to funding and connections, because I do have privilege being in an institutional position to be able to do this and allow those projects to shine, get them in the spotlight, invite them to panels, get people to hear who they are and the projects that they're doing. So that's a self-responsibility that I can take in my week-to-week work, being a guest on the lands that I'm on and recognizing myself, not as an invited guest, because I'm trying to remember, there's a great Maori from Odorota saying about being careful about accepting yourself as a guest. But I went through a specific protocol with elders within the region to offer myself to the lands and in support of the communities. But don't minimize the small impacts and the small steps that can have, because it's easy to get lost in the big issues that we have within this field very easily.
Great, thank you. Carlos, I think feel free.
Thanks. And just to add to that, I think what I'm hearing is kind of the conversation is gearing to what does change look like? How do we come about change? How does we move forward? And part of the reason the blank slate question is so hard to answer is that we don't live in a vacuum, right? We don't live acontextually. We actually have a kind of a inertia from our history, inertia from our institutions, and inertia from historical background. And we need to put that into context. So answering the blank slate, it becomes really, really difficult because, again, how far back do we have to go? I just want to say that in order to imagine what change looks like, we have to kind of borrow for some examples. And that's when I engage with students, they ask me, how does this look like? And I say, well, think about the feminist movement and where that started, how the gender parity movement started and how that came to be and where we are right now. We've yet to recognize and realize all the gains that we need to see for women around the world, yet no one will kind of doubt that there's progress. If that progress is happening quickly enough, I think it isn't, right? And similarly, when we look at other movements like the civil rights movements, where we are right now, there's still work to be done, of course, but there's movement progress. So imagine those movements and how they started and where they started and how they came to be and where we are right now, right? So imagine that as kind of a framework for change. Of course, there's more urgency now because we recognize that these are costing people's lives, these are costing people's well-being, and we have the data to back that up. So it's not fair that we just sit and say, change will come. That is not something that we have to just expect and say, oh, change will come. I also just want to mention that just as the feminist movement does not equate to anti-men, of course, it's pro-women, right? Or pro-gender parity. It's many things. Just like that, the decolonization movement is not equating to anti-white. It's, again, equity pro. So I just want to bring those perspectives into mind so we can put that into context on what change looks like and how that happens. And I had another note here, but I'm just going to stop there to give other people a chance.
That's great. Thank you. And I think when you're talking about equity pro, really getting at this idea of ownership and autonomy for countries in which this global health work, in quotations, is taking place. And coming back then to these different levels Sandeep's talking about on funding, who makes decision on where funding gets placed. I think all of these pieces come together really well. Laura, I wanted to give you a chance to answer this question, but if I can also throw an additional question to you alongside some of these practical changes we can make within the next decade, how do you see us being able to make practical changes while still staying angry and radical to still push for the full dismantlement that you talked about earlier?
Thank you. That's a really challenging question. And actually, just to go back to the original question where you asked about, how the indicators and how do we measure that we're making change. And something that I've also been really reflecting on recently when we talk about measuring progress whenever we're starting initiatives, whether it's initiatives on racial equity, gender equity in institutions, or, in research, is I always like to think of, first of all, who designed these measurements, right? Who is deciding what is progress? And I think we've all touched on this during, all the panels have talked about this, is that really, as we're having this conversation, we're obviously positioned in the US. And so we're pretty much coming from that view and lens. But just being clear that sometimes when we're thinking about how do we choose an indicator, right, we have to be careful and think of who is deciding that is progress, because we don't get to say what progress looks like. In the same way, I'm Tanzanian American, I'm originally from Tanzania, and what progress would look like for me as a woman from Tanzania who has immigrated to the US is going to look very different for someone who never left Tanzania. That progress of decolonization is going to look very, very different, and we're going to have very different lenses. And so I think that's what makes this question really difficult. But then to go into what I can think of, what I can sort of imagine and what I really hope to see. And I'm coming from the perspective of, I am a young clinical research professional. I just did field work, just 3 years ago, I was in the field working in Tanzania. And for me, just kind of a personal anecdote, I remember going in thinking, well, I'm going back home. So I can't be doing that much harm, right? And again, forgetting that positionality of, well, Laura, you have the privilege of leaving after 10 weeks. After these 10 weeks are done, your visa's over, right? And then you have to go back to the US. And so I'm still participating in the system where I'm dropping in for a short period of time, as was mentioned in one of the videos, and I have my objectives and my checklist of, well, I need to complete my fieldwork project. I have a thesis to write. And so I'm thinking of, well, I need to graduate. But then going in and really not thinking of that I'm encountering people in the communities, even though they're my people, we're all Tanzanian, we're both Tanzanian, but they have a history and they have lives before I entered and met them, right? And then they're going to have lives in their future after I leave. And so what does that look like when I am dropping in and disrupting what their trajectory of their lives, and inserting my own objectives and my own priorities and research, and how, I mean, I'm focused on, well, it's my degree, but really it's, yes, but there are material consequences of the work that I'm going to do in this community, even if it is my community, I'm still causing harm. And so one thing that I really want to see change, and in terms of how training is designed in terms of with education, is we stop viewing low and middle income countries as training centers. We stop viewing low and middle income countries as really, for lack of a better term, playgrounds for young trainees and students. Because we need to start remembering that there are very real material consequences and people who live with those material consequences of colonialism every single day. And while we all will be affected based on our different identities, it's still very different to be in that community, in that space every single day versus me coming in with my own priorities. And so I hope to see the shift in ideology of, for example, like in one of the videos mentioning for med school applications where it's viewed favorably. I think it's changing right now with the more holistic approach, but for a while I know it was viewed favorably if you had volunteer experience in, Africa, and I'm using that in quotes, and shifting that ideology to where students or young people or people who are training don't feel like they need to go into these communities in order for them to advance their careers, because they're not their training centers. They don't exist there to be your playing ground. Those are real communities, people who live real lives, and again, who have a history before you showed up there and will have lives after. And so for me, a change I really want to see is that shift of we stop viewing field work as something that's coming from the US and you're going out, looking at what does that look like to do global health field work locally, within your own community, within your own backyard. And also, what does that look like when we're providing the same opportunities for people in low and middle income countries to come here, or not just to come to the US, but also to travel to other places and other communities. So just really moving from this unidirectional flow of knowledge, unidirectional flow of what experience looks like, and ignoring that there are, people have historicities and they have lives that are very much impacted with the research that we do, especially when we're doing this very parachuting in, and then we get to just leave whenever our time is up, and we sometimes don't even think about the people that we've encountered again because we're moving on to the next thing.
Sorry, Laura, can I just sort of add and ask, you talk about feeling like you were coming home, and realizing that your experience wasn't exactly the same. How did you grapple with that? When did you realize that this is not what you thought it was going to be, but acknowledge that you're there for a set amount of time and then need to go back? Because I think for a lot of us as trainees, the reality is that we have a set amount of time to be in these spaces and have the intention of building our lives and careers around this work. But the way the process works, you're there for a couple of weeks, a couple of months. So I'm just curious, again, when did you realize this wasn't what you expected? And then how did you grapple with that?
Yeah, and I'll try to keep this really brief. But for me, it really came from when I was doing a research project, and this was in undergrad, so 7-8 years ago, very much young, very much naive, but similar thing of very much parachuting into this community. And I'm talking to one of these participants and they answer the questions and it was great. And towards the end of the interview, I asked, oh, do you have any questions for me? And the question that this woman asked me was, well, what do I get? And I did not have an answer for her. I did not have, or I came up with a very much BS answer that I like to, think of now. I'm like, that was very much on the fly because I was put on the spot. And for me, that was the moment of realizing this is not what I expected it to be, because I thought I would not be causing any harm. I thought that, oh, we understand each other because we're from the same background, same ethnicities, same nationality, and realizing that this woman's like, no, I'm answering your questions and you are finishing your research, and I'm happy to do that, but you're going to go back to America and you're going to get your degree and I will still be here. What do I get? And, and she was not talking about what compensation am I getting? She's not talking about, oh, how will this help, future intervention? She's like, no, what do I get? Because again, when you leave, I will still be here. And for me, the grappling with that was really starting to kind of catapulted me into what the last decade has been, of asking myself that question of, when I'm going home, what are they getting from me being there? And a lot of it really has been sitting in that discomfort of some harm, that discomfort of, yes, I am engaging with people from my own community, but there is still some level of harm that I am causing because I am participating in this very oppressive system. And that grappling has just come from having those moments of discomfort and sitting in that. But then also when I have the ability to push back, is pushing back to my trainers and my professors and my advisors and say, hey, there's something that really needs to change here. And one of those is, and I think just to quickly wrap up is, yes, you're going there for a short amount of time, but there is definitely work that can be done before you're in that community, physically. There's work and reflection that can be done beforehand in order to start that discomfort and start that moment of like really thinking of, what is that going to look like when I'm in there a short amount of time and then I leave? And what are the people that I'm going to interact with? What are they going to be getting? And what will they be left with after I have left and I have completed my training or my field work?
Great. Thank you. Really great. And I think there's a lot of good points that are hit on here. I think one thing I do want to just mention in terms of the measurement and how do we measure progress? What does that look like for anti-colonialism, for decolonization? I agree, there's not great measurements to date on how we're moving that way. One resource I do want to just share, and it's in the chat, is Global Health 50/50, and they come out with annual reports around a variety of equitable outcomes, one being the proportion of global health organizations that are led by individuals from low and middle income countries, as well as by women. And they look at this across boards, I think also presidents and also funding sources. So just putting that in the chat as one resource that may be helpful. So we have a little less than 20 minutes left. Our final question that we want to get to, and we'll move to one more smaller set of videos and then open questions, is around medical students and trainees. And all of you have touched on this a bit. Laura, you just touched on it a lot, but we want to get to some of the very specifics on what toolbox or skill sets should medical students or trainees have as they start looking at getting into the field of global health and looking at working with partners to develop these projects together. So I guess I'll open it up. Carlos, can I actually start with you? I know you do a lot of work with medical students as well.
Could you repeat the question just so I know I got it clearly?
Yeah. What tools or points of reflection would you say medical students or trainees need to have in order to be part of the solution for anti-colonialism within global health?
Sure, thanks for repeating that. I was typing in something in the chat about Global Health 50/50 as you were asking, but I think a lot of it relates to what Laura was saying. One is that preparatory work. Preparatory work is not only about reflection, it's also engaging with critical reading. I think we have to be able to engage with critical reading and then reflect, right? Or that process has to happen parallelly. Now, not everyone is born in known. We are currently living through a culture that kind of punishes sometimes the learning process, and we must step away from that. People can grow, people can change opinion. That's why we learn. So understanding that that process will happen as we're engaging with this critical literature. I just finished a very basic book, which is Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. A lot of it that I did not know about US culture, because I'm not a US American, I got from that book, and it's allowing me to understand better how race relations that happens at the United States. I might have made mistakes before, doesn't mean I'm kind of overtly racist. I just did not know the whole context. So we got to give ourselves a break when we don't know enough. That's one thing, right? Allow ourselves to be porous to that learning. So medical students out there, do not feel bad for not knowing everything about how the context works. Do feel bad if you're not kind of wanting to learn about it. You have to want to learn about this. And this is one of the value system of global health has to change. In that sense, just key central thing, engage in that critical reflection, engage in that critical literature. You're going to gain a lot about it, out of it. And then when you are engaging with a community, a context that is different to yours, make sure you're learning about the history, but from different perspectives and different voices. If you manage to get that, I think you'll be a much better learner. I think your learning objectives will be over-exceeded, and you'll be able to start creating new understandings of what you're doing wherever it is that you're doing, be it at a local community right next door to where you live, or half across the world in sub-Saharan Africa, like Laura was recently. So that'll be my kind of 2 cents in this question.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carlos. Any other thoughts on this? Nicole or Sandeep?
Yeah, just quickly. Yeah, I don't think I had much of a toolbox when I started in global health, and I think that we're all standing on the shoulders of giants of those that came before, and I think those that come after you, students, will be standing on your shoulders. And I think there's some incredible questions in the chat, and this is what we have to figure out. This is, I think, all of us are learning. This kind of conversation, as Nicole said, wasn't happening a few years ago. In my 15 years overseas, we really never had this conversation, and we're learning. So maybe next year, I think this is the first time this is being done at UCLA. Is that Kate, correct, Kate? This kind of panel?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think we're all evolving, and I think that it's these kinds of questions that are being asked will push all of us to figure this out. And my main message there is that we need to have this discomfort at every level when we're engaging and learning, and trying to figure out new ways of doing things, and pushing each other to be more accountable to a better future. Going overseas, I think the biggest tool in the toolbox is just listening. I agree that preparatory work is really critical to do, and pausing, waiting, and staying quiet and just trying to build relationships is probably the most important tool that you have.
Great, thank you. I think, Nicole, feel free to jump in, and then I have one follow-up question on this before we go to the videos.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things to remember is just to be kind to ourselves. It's a lot of work being a medical student. There's lots going on, lots of knowledge being packed in, and a lot of pressures happening as well. So just self-care, I think, is important not to forget about in that process. And, I really want to emphasize, because it can be disheartening sometimes when you're in a helping profession. You want to help. That's, why you come to this field. You want to support people and communities. And oftentimes that passion is so very strong that, it can take over many processes and emotions, and sometimes rational thought, in some cases. And, what I always am reminded by some of my elders who brilliantly said, of course, we have one mouth and two ears for a reason. And that is really emphasizing that piece of being able to close and open, and how powerful that process is, not only in being with patients, but also in being with communities. I remember sometimes with patients not even saying a word, because we're trained into the system here where, we have to have the answers for everything within 10 minutes based on whatever presentation that somebody's happening. But that's not the way we do healthcare in many of our communities around the globe traditionally. It was based on listening, and you sat there and you listened, sometimes for an hour, sometimes 2 hours, sometimes 4 hours, to that patient's journey or the family's journey in that process. And that's okay. That was healing in and of itself. So my suggestion as well is to be open to other ways of medicine and knowing, not necessarily just global health perspectives, because oftentimes it is pushing westernized medical care systems that are based on Western ways of viewing and knowing, and not forgetting that those communities also have traditional medicine systems and systems that have been in place for thousands of years that work very well for their communities. And that's one sort of missing link that we don't often hear about within this global health conversation. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point. And a lot of, again, synergies coming from all of you around listening, around having grace for ourselves, but doing the work, the preparatory work to know what we're coming into and to not come in with our own agendas. Because of our time, I am going to move us to the videos, and then we can ask some of these final questions after the video as time allows. So we'll now play a short, about 4-minute clip from our co-panelists in Peru and Malawi, again, on their thoughts on what tools students need to have as they come into these type of partnerships. So Vijeta, if you can go ahead and play the video.
At the same time, it's very important that students understand that the experience of working in global health earlier in their career is not necessarily experience of scientific performance, but it's very important that it has to be a huge, large component of cultural understanding and awareness and introduction. It's very important that when students come to a place like Peru, they get really involved as much as they can into the local environment, so they can have a deep understanding of how does it work, what are the limitations, and what roles they can play down the road. That the communities that they interact become vastly local, and they don't live in their own, foreign communities, just going through the same information and the same experiences, the same points of view, but they broaden their vision. And many students do this very successfully, but not all. And I think that makes it a big change, a big difference. This is not about my application next year or in 2 years. This is about the next decades of your career. And this is about the partnerships that you're going to forge on the ground. And this is about how you develop over time. This is a marathon. It's about patience. It's about long-term returns, not low-hanging fruit.
So as medical students, what I usually say, or if there are people who are going on international programs, what I advise is that when you go to the countries, when you arrive, I know you are at a peak. I usually say you have a lot of worms in the heads, which are making you to think very fast and strategically. And so I say you are dynamic and you have a lot of information. When you come into the, for example, let's say we come to Malawi, step back. When you meet a team, step back and understand the context which is available there. Then the people, then how actually the thought process is, because you can bring up an idea which might not make sense to other people until you have contextualized it. So in that case, let the people and let the context understand the way things are. And in that case now, start to think through and introduce a topic after the other, so that in that case, you do not overwhelm the people on the ground. In that case, you're going to involve the people whereby some of them will bring ideas which you take on board. You bring ideas which are going to be taken on board. Then out of the 5 ideas, which 3 from you, 2 from the others, you might have 3 which you want to pursue. In that case, there's ownership which is available amongst the people on the ground and yourself. And you enjoy your life when you go out in that way, because you earn a lot of respect. And at the same time, it feels good when actually you are working with the team who are able to actually stop you for a moment and say, can you clarify on this? Otherwise, people will just sit like this and listen to you. At the end, you say, is there any question? They say there's no question. I can tell you, you come out of that meeting, that is it. There's nothing which is going to happen from there. So my advice is that in that metaphorical toolbox is really to make sure that you say, when I'm going out there, I know that there are people and they have their thinking and they have their capacity, they have their ideas, let me listen to them, and then let me now be able, I'm not saying that you just take whatever they're saying, but you can work as a team to come up with a good thing. So in that case, you work together on the projects, there's a good relationship, and also in that case, you'll be able to give them a chance to reflect on what it means to be with a different group that you can work together.
Great. So there are some of the thoughts from our colleagues in Peru and Malawi. We have a little less than 8 minutes left. The hour and a half has flown by. Panelists, you've been incredible. Want to ask one question that came from the students is how do we try to dismantle the system, but within the same system, develop a career? And I think this kind of competing demands and tension between the two. So I don't know, I think we have time for 1 or 2 panelists to speak to this end. If there's any further advice you can give on how to build a career in public health and global health while at the same time working to dismantle the entire system. And it may be an overarching question that we all continue grappling with ourselves.
I can speak. We have a lot of Indigenous health experts in many countries that are not Indigenous, and this has been a contentious issue in some institutions from Indigenous peoples themselves, because they feel that a lot of these experts are speaking for them or on behalf of them without allowing them the space to speak up. We're getting better at that on Turtle Island in Canada, particularly in the United States, progressing in some institutions, still struggling a bit in Australia, New Zealand, and other locations as well. And it's an interesting conversation to have when you're on a panel, for example, of 3 other people who are non-Indigenous introducing themselves as Indigenous experts. And you can imagine how that might feel from a community standpoint when you see somebody that does not look like you who claims to be an expert within that field. We get around it a little bit within the global health because it's not naming a specific person or peoples, so to speak. Although that does happen, of course, in our institutions. So I often think about one of my very good friends, Dr. Susan Chatwood, who is a professor at the University of Alberta recently. And she's one of the only non-Indigenous scholars that I know that has managed to develop amazingly close relationships with very, very traditional Indigenous elders and people. And I think about her behavior and what she's done, and having sat with her in meetings and watched her, how much respect she has from the communities in the Canadian North is mind-boggling, which goes to show that it's very possible to do this work and make a career and gain trust of communities. And she is such a gentle spirit and soul. She listens and she works as an ally. She connects peoples. She creates memorandums of understanding. She always allows community directives to lead her research work. And I think she's, a striking example of how we can do things right, that there is a way to do the work in a culturally sensitive way that's making space for people while still having a very successful career. She was named a Canadian Governor General. She's had a number of awards, and she's very humble all in that process of doing it. So there's people out there doing this work in a good way, and I think it is possible with deep reflection and being very humble in the process.
Great, thank you. And I think another piece from our Malawi experience around research is just authorship, that if there's not a person from the local community who is a co-lead or the lead for a project, then that project may not be something that should be pursued. And that should then be reflective in who's listed on the grant application, if it's a grant, or who is the author and in what positions. Great points. So with our last, we are about done. If there's any, we have about 1 minute. If there's anyone who has something burning to say within a minute, otherwise we will wrap up and hand it over to Riza Hoffman to close us out. Okay.
Just to say that, as I mean, you can imagine most of the students are listening, do push for the change you want to see. Do not let your faculty get away with stuff that you don't think that is right. I think, again, what you've heard today and what you've been kind of reading about, just put it in action, as Nicole was saying just now. Live up to those values, and you'll see that your career will unfold in front of you, and in a way that, again, you can do that. I mean, again, the awards, the kind of the grant money, the higher paying jobs, that is secondary if your values are in the right place, which is doing the work that is right with the people in a horizontal manner. So that will become the primary goal. So just, again, push your faculty, your deans, your provosts to do the things that are right. And one of the most astounding thing, and this is the last thing I'll say, I work in planetary health education. Most of the change is actually coming from the students, and that makes me so happy. So I would like to see the same thing happening in the decolonization movement. So just encourage all of you to push farther and farther, and hopefully we'll see the change in a couple of years.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Absolutely true. UCLA students in the global health program, that's to you. Please push your mentors, challenge us. We're all on this path together, and we need to move together to decolonization. Thank you. Riza, over to you.
Yeah, so I just want to really give a very heartfelt thanks to our panelists, Laura, Sandeep, Carlos, and Nicole, for bringing such honesty and wonderful experiences. We really are honored to have you. We've been following your careers with great interest, and really we were beyond expectation in terms of the just wonderful kind of really deep substance that you've brought to this discussion. So thank you so much. Thanks to Ags and Kate for a wonderful job moderating, and also to off-screen Tracy Wells and Vijeta Vaswani. My internet is unstable. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Bad timing. We do really think about this as the beginning with the medical students and others who have joined us to continue these conversations. I think to have humility, to reflect, to really desire big change, but understand that there are going to be many small steps, and that together we can start to take these steps. So we're going to have a blog that we're going to release to the students, and we're looking forward to having more conversation about some of the questions that were posed in the chat, as well as conversations throughout the selective and the pathway as we begin this journey together. So thank you everyone for joining. Again, thanks to our panelists and moderators, and everyone stay safe and take care.